The Galactic Academy's elite cadets had been preparing for this mission for months. The instructors had warned them that the oxygen-starved moon of Zoraxis 4 would push their limits, testing both their survival skills and their resilience. As the shuttle descended, Grace Cruz sat quietly, her hands resting on her knees, her breathing calm and measured. Around her, the other cadets whispered among themselves, discussing strategies and sharing rumors about the last team that had failed this mission. Grace, a human cadet among a group of alien elites, kept her thoughts to herself, knowing that speaking up now would only draw more unwanted attention. The shuttle finally touched down, its engines hissing as the doors slid open. The atmosphere outside was dim, with a pale violet sky stretching endlessly over the rocky landscape. The facility loomed ahead, an imposing structure of metal and glass, half buried in the dusty terrain. The air was thin, but not unbreathable, at least not for the short walk from the shuttle to the entrance. As Grace adjusted her oxygen mask, she noticed a few alien cadets struggling to secure their equipment, clearly unaccustomed to manual adjustments. One of them, a lanky Venarian named Ralzek, scoffed at her simple mask. "Primitive human tech," he muttered, his mandibles clicking in disdain. "My filtration unit is calibrated for optimal intake." Grace didn't respond, knowing that arguing with him would be pointless. Instead, she focused on the checklist displayed on her wrist monitor, mentally running through the protocol. The cadets lined up as the lead instructor, Commander Zolvar, addressed them through the helmet comms. His voice was sharp and authoritative, demanding attention. "Listen up. You are here to survive for 3 days inside the Zoraxis 4 research facility. Your main task is to monitor the oxygen levels, maintain the filtration systems, and ensure the stability of the environment. Do not, under any circumstances, tamper with the power grid. Any questions?" Silence followed, but Grace could sense the tension among the cadets. Most of them had spent their lives relying on advanced technology, and the idea of manual survival was foreign to them. Grace glanced at her equipment. Just the basics: a mask, a small toolkit, and a compact survival kit strapped to her thigh. She knew that if something went wrong, it wouldn't be the advanced gear that saved them. It would be ingenuity and adaptability. Once inside, the cadets spread out, exploring the facility. The walls were lined with oxygen generators and filtration units, humming softly. Grace inspected one of the generators, noting its maintenance log. It hadn't been serviced in months. A quiet alarm bell rang in her mind, but she pushed it aside, trusting that the instructors wouldn't send them into an unsafe environment. Hours passed uneventfully. The cadets took turns monitoring the control panels, recording oxygen levels, and practicing basic maintenance procedures. Grace spent most of her shift quietly observing the others. Some of the alien cadets joked about the simplicity of the assignment, convinced it was more of a training exercise than a real test. Commander Exelvar occasionally walked past, his stern gaze reminding them to stay focused. It wasn't until the second night that things began to unravel. Grace was on watch duty when she noticed a flicker in the overhead lights, a faint buzzing noise humming through the walls. She pressed her earpiece. "Commander, there's a fluctuation in the power grid, requesting permission to run diagnostics." Before Exelvar could respond, the lights cut out completely, plunging the facility into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the corridors in a sickly red glow. Grace glanced at the control panel, watching the oxygen levels plummet. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the generators had stopped functioning. Panic erupted around her. The cadets in the adjacent room began shouting, their voices overlapping in a chaotic blur. Grace forced herself to stay calm, breathing slowly to conserve oxygen. She pushed past the others, moving toward the central hub where Commander Exelvar was already barking orders. "The backup system should have kicked in," shouted Ralzek, his voice tinged with fear. His elongated limbs twitched nervously, and Grace could see his breathing become erratic. Zolvar clenched his jaw, slamming his fist against the console. "The power surge must have fried the circuitry. We need to restore manual control, but the system is completely unresponsive. Cadets, check the auxiliary panels, see if any circuits are still intact." Grace knew that even if they restored power, the oxygen levels were already dangerously low. She glanced at the vent system, noticing a faint whistling sound. "Commander, the vents are leaking," she reported. Exelvar shot her a glare. "Seal them off. Use anything you can find. We need to contain the oxygen. The cadets scrambled to comply, using adhesive patches from the emergency kits to block the vents. Grace worked quickly, her hands steady as she secured one of the major leaks. Around her, some of the cadets were already showing signs of hypoxia, dizziness, confusion, and shallow breathing. Grace could hear Ralzek muttering to himself, his voice cracking with anxiety. She moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. Focus on your breathing, slow, steady breaths. You're burning through your oxygen too fast. Relic looked at her with wide, fearful eyes. This shouldn't be happening. The filtration units were state-of-the-art. How can they fail? Grace didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing. Relying solely on technology was a mistake. The Academy had always taught them to trust their gear, but Grace had learned differently, growing up in the harsh human colonies. Sometimes the simplest methods were the most reliable. As she secured the last vent, Grace glanced at the oxygen meter on her wrist. It was dropping steadily. She couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration. No matter how well she patched the leaks, it wouldn't be enough. She looked around at the cadets, some slumped against the walls, others pacing frantically. Grace's mind raced, searching for a solution. That's when she remembered the algae tanks. During her briefing, she had read about the research facility's experiments with oxygen-producing algae. If the generators were down, perhaps those algae could provide a temporary solution. She just needed to find the tanks and see if they were still viable. Determined, Grace pushed past the crowded room and headed toward the lower levels, where the research labs were located. The corridors were darker here, and the red emergency lights seemed even more oppressive. As she moved, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If she didn't find a way to restore oxygen soon, the cadets wouldn't survive the night. Reaching the lab doors, she forced them open manually, straining against the sealed mechanisms. Inside, the air was cooler, and the faint glow of bioluminescent algae caught her eye. She approached the tanks cautiously, wiping the condensation from the glass. The algae were still alive, their vibrant green tendrils swirling in the water. Grace's heart pounded as an idea took shape. She needed to set up a basic distillation process to increase the algae's oxygen output. With no time to waste, she grabbed the lab tools, determined to make it work. As the air grew thinner, she couldn't afford a single mistake. Survival depended on her ingenuity, and on the humble algae that everyone else had overlooked. Grace's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the algae tank, her eyes fixed on the delicate green strands swaying gently in the water. The bioluminescent glow was the only light in the lab, casting eerie, wavering shadows across the walls. Sweat trickled down her brow as she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Her breaths were shallow, each one feeling thinner than the last. The air was running out faster than she had anticipated. Behind her, the corridor echoed with frantic shouts. Cadets stumbled through the darkness, some of them gasping for air as the oxygen levels continued to plummet. Ralzek's voice echoed down the hallway, his tone sharp and frantic. "Commander Exelvar, the auxiliary systems aren't responding. We're suffocating in here." Grace's jaw clenched as she connected the final tube to the algae tank, securing it with a makeshift clamp. The algae, though small, were still producing oxygen through photosynthesis. But it wouldn't be enough, not with the number of cadets in the facility. She needed to find a way to amplify the process. In the main control room, Commander Exelvar loomed over the central console, his fists clenched as he barked orders to the remaining cadets. His silver-blue skin glistened with sweat, and his eyes flickered with frustration. "Check the circuits again!" he shouted. "If we don't restore power soon, we're all going to black out." Ralzek stood nearby, his eyes wide and unfocused. He clutched his filtration unit to his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to keep his breathing under control. "Commander, what about the emergency oxygen reserves? Can we access them?" Zolvar's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "The reserves were compromised during the power surge. The containment units are locked, and without power there's no way to open them. We're on our own." Ralzek's face fell, his elongated limbs trembling as he struggled to stay upright. The other cadets huddled together, their eyes darting nervously from one corner of the room to another. Panic was spreading like a contagion, infecting each of them as the realization sank in. They were trapped in a sealed facility with rapidly depleting oxygen and no viable escape. Grace moved quickly, her hands working with practiced precision as she set up a second algae tank. Her mind raced, calculations flashing through her head as she considered the potential oxygen output. The algae could provide a temporary supply, but not nearly enough to sustain everyone. She needed to increase the algae population, but that would take time. Time they didn't have. Her gaze fell to a nearby shelf lined with lab containers, some filled with nutrient-rich solutions used for cultivating alien plant life. A plan began to form in her mind. If she could accelerate the algae's growth using the nutrient solution, she might be able to boost the oxygen output enough to keep them alive. But the process was risky. Too much nutrient, and the algae could overpopulate, consuming more oxygen than they produced. Grace took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had to take the risk. There was no other option. Back in the control room, Exolvar slammed his fist against the console, his frustration boiling over. This was supposed to be a controlled training exercise. How did we end up in this mess? Alzek swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. Commander, shouldn't we send out a distress signal? Someone has to know we're in trouble. Swaying exalted as he shook his head. The communications system is down. The power surge fried the main antenna, and without a functioning generator, we can't even send a basic SOS. We're cut off. Alek's breathing quickened, his eyes wild as he clutched the console for support. But what about Grace? She's been down in the labs for a while now. What is she even doing? Sholvar's brow furrowed, his gaze hardening. Probably wasting time with that primitive algae tank. If she thinks that's going to save us, she's delusional. Ralzek opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden crash echoed through the facility, sending a jolt of fear through everyone. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The emergency lights sputtered, their red glow dimming as the power reserves drained away. The air was growing thinner by the second, and Grace could feel her lungs working harder to draw in each breath. In the lab, Grace gritted her teeth as she poured the nutrient solution into the algae tanks, her hands shaking with urgency. The algae reacted instantly, expanding and releasing tiny bubbles of oxygen that floated to the surface. Grace leaned closer, watching the bubbles rise. It was working, but it wasn't enough. The oxygen output was still too low. She glanced around the lab, her mind racing. If she could connect more tanks, she might be able to distribute the oxygen more effectively. But that would mean dismantling some of the existing equipment that could be crucial if the power ever came back online. Grace closed her eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. The air felt thinner than before, and her chest tightened with each inhale. She couldn't waste any more time. Decision made, she grabbed a wrench and began dismantling the nearby equipment, stripping it down to its core components. Tubes, filters, and containers clattered to the floor as she worked, her hands moving with determined precision. Meanwhile, in the control room, Exolvar's breathing grew labored, his eyes unfocused as he leaned against the console. Ralzak's skin had turned a sickly gray, and the other cadets lay slumped against the walls, some of them barely conscious. The oxygen levels were dropping fast, and with no way to restore power, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. "Commander," Ralzak rasped, his voice weak and strained, "we need to do something. We're running out of air." Exolvar's eyes darkened as he struggled to remain upright. "There's nothing we can do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Unless someone finds a way to produce oxygen, we're done for." Back in the lab, Grace connected the last algae tank to the makeshift distribution system, her fingers numb and shaking. The tanks bubbled softly, the algae churning in the nutrient-rich water. The oxygen output began to increase, but Grace knew it wouldn't last. The algae would eventually consume the nutrients, and without power to circulate fresh air, the facility would become a sealed tomb. She slumped against the wall, her head spinning as darkness encroached on the edges of her vision. The air was dangerously thin now, and Grace could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her body screaming for oxygen. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. Pushing herself to her feet, Grace stumbled toward the lab entrance, her vision blurring as she fought to stay conscious. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, the emergency lights barely illuminating the way. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself had turned to lead. But she had to reach the control room. She had to tell Zolbar that the algae tanks were working, that they still had a chance. however slim it might be. Grace's breaths came in ragged gasps as she reached the control room door, her vision swimming with black spots. Inside, Exolvar and Ralzek lay slumped against the wall, their chests rising and falling weakly. The other cadets were unconscious, their faces pale and still. Grace's legs buckled and she collapsed to the floor, her cheek pressed against the cold metal. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the soft green glow of the algae tanks, their oxygen bubbles rising slowly, steadily, their only hope. Grace's eyelids fluttered open, and the first thing she became aware of was the suffocating pressure in her chest. Each breath felt like pulling air through a pinhole. Her head throbbed, and her vision swam in and out of focus. The dim emergency lights overhead cast an eerie, flickering red glow across the control room. Grace's cheek was pressed against the cold, metallic floor, her body splayed awkwardly near the door. Slowly she pushed herself onto her hands and knees, her muscles trembling with the effort. The air was so thin now that even this small movement sent her heart racing and her head spun violently. She swallowed against the nausea that surged in her throat, forcing herself to breathe slowly, methodically, as she had been trained to do in hypoxic conditions. Across the room, Commander Exolvar slumped against the wall, his head tilted back and his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. Beside him, Ralzek lay sprawled on the floor, his elongated limbs tangled beneath him. His skin had turned an ashen gray, and his breathing was nearly imperceptible. The other cadets were similarly strewn about the control room, unconscious or barely clinging to consciousness. Grace gritted her teeth, her mind racing. The algae tanks! She had set them up, connected them, but it wasn't enough. The oxygen output had stabilized somewhat, but the facility was simply too large and the number of cadets too many for the algae tanks to keep up. She needed to find a way to increase the oxygen production. And fast. With effort, Grace crawled to the wall, using it for support as she struggled to her feet. The floor seemed to sway beneath her, and dark spots danced before her eyes. The edges of her vision were tinged with black, but she forced herself to stay upright. One step. Another. She moved toward the control panel, her hand trailing along the wall to keep herself balanced. The panel was dark, its screen cracked and lifeless. Grace's eyes darted to the oxygen meter. It was barely holding at critical levels. The algae tanks were producing some oxygen, but it was being consumed faster than it could be replenished. Grace's breaths came in shallow gasps, her lungs straining against the thinning air. She had to get to the lab. The algae were the only chance they had. If she could amplify their oxygen production, she might be able to keep everyone alive long enough for the power to come back on. Grace pushed away from the control panel, her legs shaking as she stumbled toward the door. The corridor stretched before her like a never-ending tunnel, the emergency lights casting ominous shadows along the walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air had thickened into a dense, invisible fog. Halfway down the corridor, Grace's knees buckled, and she collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Her head swam, and the floor wavered beneath her like a mirage. The temptation to close her eyes and sink into unconsciousness was overwhelming, but she couldn't give in. Not now. Not yet. Grace gripped the wall, forcing herself to focus. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms until the pain sharpened her senses. Then, with a grunt of effort, she pushed herself upright and continued forward, her eyes fixed on the door to the lab. When she finally reached it, her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely grasp the door handle. It took 3 tries to pull it open, and when she did, she nearly fell through the doorway, collapsing on her hands and knees on the cold lab floor. The algae tanks glowed softly in the dim light, their green tendrils swaying gently in the nutrient-rich water. Grace crawled to the nearest tank, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The algae were still alive, still producing oxygen, but it wasn't enough. She had to increase the surface area. Grace's eyes darted around the lab, searching for anything she could use. Her gaze landed on a stack of empty glass containers on a nearby shelf. If she could divide the algae and distribute them across multiple containers, she could potentially increase the oxygen output. It was a desperate plan, but it was all she had. With shaking hands, Grace pulled herself to her feet and staggered to the shelf. She grabbed the glass containers, her fingers slipping on the smooth surface as she struggled to keep her grip. The lab seemed to spin around her, the air growing thinner by the second. Grace set the containers on the counter, her chest heaving as she fought to draw in air. Her vision blurred, and a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her to steady herself against the counter. She couldn't afford to pass out now. Not when she was so close. Using a sterilized knife, Grace sliced through the algae, dividing them into smaller clusters. Each cluster was placed in a separate glass container filled with nutrient solution. The process was slow, her hands shaking uncontrollably, but she kept going, forcing herself to move faster despite the crushing fatigue. Once the containers were filled, she connected them with a series of makeshift tubes, creating a rudimentary network that would distribute the oxygen evenly throughout the lab. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was better than nothing. Grace's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, her back against the counter. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths, her vision flickering as the world grew darker around her. The algae tanks bubbled softly, their green glow casting strange, ethereal patterns on the ceiling. Grace's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment she was back on Earth, standing on the edge of a vast, endless ocean, the salty wind whipping through her hair. The air was thick and cool, and she could breathe deeply, filling her lungs with life-giving oxygen. But the image dissolved as quickly as it had come, leaving her gasping and alone on the cold metal floor. Somewhere in the distance, Grace heard the faint sound of a voice, a deep, booming voice that echoed through the corridor. "Commander X-Olvar." He was calling out, but his words were muffled and indistinct, as though he were speaking underwater. Grace forced her eyes open, her head lolling to the side as she struggled to focus. The algae tanks bubbled steadily, tiny oxygen bubbles rising to the surface and bursting in the thin, stale air. The oxygen levels were rising, but not fast enough. If the power didn't come back soon, it wouldn't matter how many algae tanks she set up. Grace's eyelids grew heavy, her vision fading in and out as the darkness crept closer. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the soft green glow of the algae, their tendrils waving like tiny underwater plants, fighting to keep her alive. Grace's eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment the world around her was a hazy blur of green and red. The algae tanks glowed softly, casting eerie, wavering shadows across the lab walls. Grace lay sprawled on the cold metal floor, her limbs heavy and numb. The air was thin, each breath a shallow gasp that barely filled her lungs. Her head throbbed violently, and the edges of her vision pulsed with darkness. Slowly, she forced herself to sit up, her back pressing against the counter for support. The room swayed around her, and Grace gritted her teeth, fighting the dizziness that threatened to pull her back into unconsciousness. Her breaths came in short, rapid bursts, and her chest burned with every inhale. Her gaze drifted to the algae tanks. The green tendrils swayed gently, releasing tiny bubbles that rose to the surface and burst, each one carrying a minuscule amount of oxygen into the air. The tanks were working, but not fast enough. Grace's heart pounded as she calculated the remaining time. The oxygen levels had stabilized slightly, but the supply was dwindling. She dragged herself to her feet, her legs shaking as she stumbled to the lab door. The corridor outside was deathly silent, and the emergency lights flickered weakly, casting ominous red shadows along the walls. Grace swallowed against the dryness in her throat. The cadets were still unconscious, and Commander X-Olvar had been slipping in and out of consciousness. Grace's fists clenched at her sides. The algae tanks were her only hope, but the current setup wasn't enough. If she didn't find a way to amplify the oxygen production, the cadets wouldn't last another hour. She had to act now. She forced herself to move forward, each step a monumental effort as her muscles screamed in protest. The control room loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar. Grace pushed them open, her heart sinking at the sight before her. Ralzek lay slumped against the wall, his limbs sprawled limply around him. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic gasps, and his skin had turned a sickly shade of gray. Across the room, Commander Zolvar was on the floor, his eyes half open but unfocused. His breaths were slow, his chest barely moving. Grace swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She dropped to her knees beside Ralsek, her hands trembling as she pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was weak and thready, but it was there. Grace exhaled in relief, her breath shaking. "Ralsek?" she whispered, leaning closer to his ear. "Can you hear me?" Ralsek's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. He blinked several times, his lips moving as though he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Grace leaned closer, straining to hear him. "Air," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Can't breathe." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "Hold on," she said, her voice firm despite the panic rising within her. "I'm going to get you more oxygen." She pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbling beneath her. Grace's gaze darted to the control panel, the oxygen meter blinking urgently. The levels were dropping rapidly. Grace bit down on her lower lip, her mind racing. The algae tanks were producing some oxygen, but not enough to sustain everyone. Grace's eyes fell to the emergency oxygen reserves, located in the far corner of the room. The storage unit was locked, a thick steel door standing between her and the precious oxygen tanks inside. The power surge had fried the locking mechanism, rendering it useless. Grace clenched her fists, frustration boiling within her. The oxygen reserves were so close, yet completely inaccessible. She needed a way to bypass the lock, but in her current state she could barely think straight. Her head spun, and dark spots danced before her eyes. She pressed a hand to her forehead, forcing herself to focus. There had to be another way. The algae tanks were her only option, but she needed to amplify the oxygen production. Grace's gaze swept the room, her eyes landing on the filtration units that lined the walls. A plan began to form in her mind. If she could redirect the filtration units to channel the algae-produced oxygen into a centralized system, she might be able to increase the overall output. But it was a risky move. The filtration units were designed to purify air, not distribute it. If she made a mistake, she could end up releasing the oxygen too quickly, wasting the limited supply they had left. Grace shook her head, her jaw set. She didn't have a choice. It was all or nothing now. With renewed determination, she staggered toward the filtration units, her breaths coming in short, labored gasps. The control panel for the units was dim, its screen cracked and lifeless. Grace pried the panel open, her fingers fumbling as she searched for the manual override switch. Sweat dripped down her brow, stinging her eyes as she worked. Each second felt like an eternity, and the room seemed to close in around her, the air growing thinner with every breath. Grace's hands shook as she located the override switch, flipping it with a sharp click. The filtration units hummed to life, a low mechanical drone echoing through the room. Grace exhaled in relief, her heart pounding in her chest. She had power, at least for now. Grace grabbed a length of tubing from the supply closet, her hands moving quickly as she connected the algae tanks to the filtration units. The setup was crude and hastily assembled, but it would have to do. The tubing snaked across the floor, connecting each algae tank to a central intake valve. Grace stepped back, her chest heaving as she surveyed her work. The algae tanks bubbled steadily, the green tendrils swaying in the nutrient-rich water. Oxygen bubbles rose to the surface, drifting through the tubes and into the filtration units. Grace closed her eyes, her breaths coming in slow, shallow gasps. It was working, but the air was still dangerously thin. Grace sank to the floor, her back against the wall as the room spun around her. The oxygen levels were rising, but not fast enough. Her gaze drifted to Ralsek, who lay motionless against the wall, his chest barely rising and falling. Across the room, Commander Zolvar was still unconscious, his skin ashen and cold. Grace pressed her palms against the cold metal floor, her vision blurring as the world dimmed around her. The algae tanks continued to bubble, their oxygen output slowly increasing, but Grace's strength was fading. Her eyelids grew heavy, her head lolling to the side as the darkness closed in. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the algae tank closest to her, its green tendrils waving like tiny underwater plants, fighting desperately to keep her alive. Grace's first conscious breath felt like inhaling fire. Her lungs expanded painfully, the sudden rush of oxygen burning through her chest. Her eyelids fluttered, and she opened her eyes to a world of blinding white light. Everything around her was too bright, too sharp, and the sound of her own heartbeat thundered in her ears. Slowly, Grace's senses began to adjust, and the brightness dimmed, revealing the familiar contours of the control room. The algae tanks continued to bubble softly, the green tendrils swaying like underwater grass in the nutrient-rich water. The tubes she had connected to the filtration units pulsed rhythmically, transporting oxygen to every corner of the room. Grace's head lolled to the side, and she saw Commander Exelvar lying on his back, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. His skin, which had been ashen and cold, now glistened with sweat, a sign that his body was finally receiving the oxygen it so desperately needed. Across the room, Ralzek's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused as he struggled to sit up. He coughed weakly, his long limbs shaking as he pushed himself upright. Grace's chest tightened at the sight of him. Ralzek had been on the brink of death, his breaths nothing more than shallow gasps, and now he was awake, blinking in confusion as he took in the sight of the algae tanks and the makeshift tubing network that Grace had assembled. Grace pressed her palms against the cold metal floor, forcing herself to sit up. Her muscles screamed in protest, every inch of her body aching from the ordeal. Her throat was raw, and her head throbbed with each pulse of her heart. But she was alive. They were all alive, Commander Zolvar groaned, his eyes squinting against the harsh white light. His gaze shifted to Grace, and his expression twisted in confusion. "What happened?" he rasped, his voice hoarse and weak. Grace licked her dry lips, forcing herself to speak despite the exhaustion weighing down her limbs. "The oxygen. The levels dropped," she said, her voice scratchy and strained. "The power surge, it knocked out the filtration units. The algae tanks, they were the only way to keep us breathing." Zor's eyes narrowed as he struggled to comprehend her words. He turned his head, his gaze falling on the algae tanks that lined the walls. The tubes connected to the filtration units pulsed steadily, the algae churning in the nutrient solution as they released precious oxygen. Ralzek's chest heaved as he drew in a deep, ragged breath, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and disbelief. You saved us," he said, his voice trembling. "Grace, you did this." Grace swallowed, her throat aching. "It was the only way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was no other option." Zolvar struggled to sit up, his jaw clenched as he forced his body to obey. He braced his hands against the wall, his breath coming in short, labored gasps. "You used the algae tanks?" Grace nodded, her vision blurring as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "I had to. The filtration units weren't enough. The power was out. The algae were the only source of oxygen we had left." Solvar's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. "You risked everything," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "If the algae hadn't worked, we'd all be dead." Grace clenched her fists, a surge of frustration rising within her. "And if I hadn't done anything, we would have died anyway," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "You were unconscious. Ralek was barely breathing. The others, they were all fading. I had to do something." Exelvar's eyes locked onto hers, his expression hard and unyielding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the soft bubbling of the algae tanks, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Then, slowly, Zolvar's shoulders sagged, and the tension drained from his face. He lowered his head, his jaw clenching as he exhaled a shuddering breath. "You're right," he said, his voice raw. "You did what you had to do. You saved us." Grace's chest tightened, and she blinked back the tears that burned behind her eyes. The adrenaline that had kept her going for so long finally began to ebb, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. Ralzek pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking as he stumbled toward the algae tanks. He pressed a hand against the glass, his eyes fixed on the green tendrils swaying inside. "I thought you were crazy," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "I thought your primitive methods were useless." Grace managed a weak, humorless smile. "Sometimes. Simple is all you need." Zolvar's gaze softened, and for the first time since Grace had joined the Galactic Academy, he looked at her not as a human cadet, but as an equal. "You kept a cool head when the rest of us panicked," he said, his voice low. "You thought outside the box. That's what real leadership looks like." Grace swallowed, the lump in her throat growing tighter. I just did what I had to do, she said, her voice breaking. I wasn't going to let anyone die. Zolvar's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of something almost like respect in his gaze. You didn't just keep us alive, he said. You taught us all a lesson. Technology can fail, but a clear mind, resourcefulness, and basic survival skills, those are things that never will. Ralzek nodded, his face somber as he continued to stare at the algae tank. I thought I was too good to learn from a human, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I was wrong. Grace's chest tightened and she closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. The exhaustion weighed her down, dragging her toward the floor, but the knowledge that she had saved them all kept her upright. The algae tanks continued to bubble, the green tendrils waving gently in the nutrient-rich water, a testament to the power of simplicity and the will to survive. Grace drew in a deep, steady breath, the air cool and fresh against her aching lungs. The oxygen was flowing now, the algae tanks producing enough to sustain them all. The power was still out, and the communication systems remained down, but for now, they were alive. For now, they had enough air to breathe.